Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Inside Voice podcast show. I'm your host, Carrie Roberts, and we are here today with another live edition. And the Inside Voice podcast is part of Voice. You can learn more about Voice at voicesummit.ai. And if you are available next Tuesday, April 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, be sure to join our Voice Talks, which is in partnership with Google Assistant. You can sign up and learn more for the free event at voicesummit.ai/talks. Now, for today's episode, I'm very excited. We are talking about emotional intelligence within the voice technology space. And I have two gentlemen here. I have Sina Kahen. He is the co-founder of the voicecourse.co. And I have Greg Hedges. He is the Chief Experience Officer over at Rain. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
So I'd love for each of you, because when we talked about doing this a few weeks ago, you both really were just so supportive of one another and what you're doing. And I'd love for you to talk about how each of you got into voice and why you chose to work together before we get into our full talk today.
Sure. Sounds good. Sina, do you want to go first with your background, and then I can talk about mine?
Sure. Sounds good. Indeed. So I actually come from a totally different area. I'm a biomedical scientist from my undergraduate studies, went into the medtech space, and I kind of started looking into what kind of user interfaces would be handy within the operating room. And obviously, since an operating room is considered quite sterile, a voice user interface for a lot of the medical devices was something that we were looking at and exploring. This was around 5-6 years ago, when voice user interfaces were pretty niche at the time. I was then joining an MBA cohort at Imperial College, and then we started learning more and more about these commercial technologies, and voice kept coming up. The professors in especially the emerging tech modules, they were letting us know how this branding that we've been seeing over the last few decades from so many companies has been dependent upon the visuals. But now with the emergence of voice assistants, these brands have to really rethink about how they're going to present themselves to the world in this auditory era. And that's really when I started looking into Google Assistant, Amazon Alexa, and we put together a group of MBA students where we essentially met up with brands, met up with companies to try and advise them on how exactly they can take advantage of this really new and exciting space.
And then, similar to Sina, came from a different background from voice, but related. Started as a graphic designer, so very much like kind of on the creative side of things. And so for the first 15 years of my career was working on, whether that be print or eventually getting into websites and applications and building out, experiences, got into some of the strategy and the planning of it a bit after all of that time as I got invested in Rain. And I've been at Rain for the last 10 years. And about 5 years ago, we were working with a client, and we'd been planning out their full kind of digital ecosystem, a new website, a new app, and social content and everything else. And Amazon opened up Alexa to developers. And so, the whole premise of what we were building was this voice of authority for people to actually get an answer to a question that they ask every day on social media: what do I make for dinner? And kind of beat themselves up when they don't have the answer. So we were working with a brand, the Campbell Soup Company, that we felt we could actually, try this out with. And at the time, there were, I think, when we launched the skill, there were 30 skills in the skill store. It was very early on, so it was a lot of learning, and it was a lot of this equity of building visual things. Now taking that into a world where we're building things that people would hear, and obviously now they have visuals associated with them. But there was a lot of, adjusting, but also a lot of truth to what we had been doing all that time and thinking about things from the user's perspective. And a lot of what had brought Sina and I together was actually thinking about things from the user's mindset, from what they need and what they want, and how that drives conversations, even if they're not happening through conversational technology. There's still conversations people are having with brands, even when they interact with them in other ways. So yes.
Yeah, and
the real love story though is me having, you missed out the most important point, which is me being a student of the MBA cohort, trying to really understand more and more about the voice space. I was looking for a voice tech mentor, so I reached out to the pioneers of the industry, Rain Agency. Obviously, found Greg on LinkedIn, reached out to him, said, "Hey, I'm trying to learn as much as I possibly can about this exciting space. Let's get together. And we've been having monthly calls since then. This was around 2 years ago, Greg.
Yeah, it was 2 years ago. Yeah, you reached out. I think
yeah.
when I like something, I start to write about it, talk about it, and say it to whoever I can find. And fortunately, it got out there into the world, and Sina found it. And I meet a lot of people, but Sina immediately, when he sent me something just saying, introducing himself, he sent an article he had written, and it was very much, in line with everything I believe. It even mentioned the word empathy, which goes into a lot of what we're going to be talking about, and how we need to really put ourselves in the place of the people on the other end of the technology that we're using in order to have a really fruitful relationship. And so that turned into a lot of, we did some work, even the master's cohort he talked about, like we did some work together with Rain and them at one point, testing out to see how we could work together. And then eventually we just said, we got to do something with this. And so it was about a year and a half ago, we decided we need to write something together. And so we talked about it a lot and started to think about this framework that we have developed for emotional intelligent voice design, and how we can pull some of that thinking that really brought us together in terms of that empathetic place of thinking about the user and drive that into creating things that are not as much like transactional. Certainly conversations are transactional, but that have the ability to step beyond that and not just be purely functional, but be emotional on the other side of it.
Yeah. And I've met a bunch of people from Rain. The agency is definitely a leader in the space and filled with very kind people, and they partner and work with a lot of people like Sina. And I think that's great. You're looking out and saying, okay, who's doing great work? How can we kind of come together? It's one of my favorite things about the voice technology space as a whole. In our conversation today about creating kind of emotionally intelligent voice experiences, can you talk about first what emotional intelligence is and why you think it's important that voice experiences have it?
Yeah, it's good to back up and try to really think about the relationship that exists between just technology in general and our emotions. The example I always give is a 3-minute space of time that you'd have on your phone. You will experience a whole series of emotions, or you're susceptible to experiencing a whole set of emotions. From receiving a text from a family member, you get some happiness within you. Getting reminded about a meeting that you were really trying to avoid, you get frustration building up in you. You get a cute video sent from your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your partner, and again, the warm feelings, the warm emotions start popping up. And before you know it, there's another video being sent to you and you're crying. So within this short space of time, interacting with these little things in our hands, so many of our emotions are being triggered. And we tend to think, a lot about our devices based on the functions that it provides. But each of these functions really start to realize that they're tethered to an emotion. So then when I realized this emotional influence that our technology is having on us, it really became clear that voice technology would have even more of an impact on our emotions, because not only is it a device that has all of those impacts that we've already mentioned, but now these devices have a voice. And voice, as we all know, is an emotional beast in and of itself. And this is really where we started to figure out, we know the impact that technology has on our emotions. Now we can see the impact that voice tech can have on emotions. How can we create these voice experiences to be cognizant of these emotional triggers? And this is really where the framework came into existence. And emotional intelligence is such a focal part of it, because we tend to think a lot about intelligence based on IQ. So the intelligence quotient of how smart someone is, all the left side stuff, the mathematical stuff, the engineering stuff. But actually, most of the studies show that the best forms of relationships, the most meaningful relationships, and even success is really considered, a focal point of it is really considered based on the EQ levels of the person. So emotional intelligence in and of itself, coined by Daniel Goleman, is the ability to identify and manage not just your own emotions, but the emotions of those you're communicating with, interacting with, and bonding with. And taking a lot of the frameworks that are out there, Greg and I sat together and thought, how can we bring these tried and tested principles from psychology, from biomimicry, from human-computer interaction, and make them relevant within the voice tech space?
And it's interesting. Somebody asked me yesterday. I was preparing for a conference where I'm going to be speaking a bit about this in a few weeks, and they were saying, can machines really be brokers of emotional intelligence? Can they really, be expected in order to behave like human beings? And the reality of it is, they actually are just brokers, right? Like, they are just the conduit through which we are sharing information. The things, the scripts we write, even the premise of what we build, it's all built from people. And so if we really understand what the people on the other end of the conversation want to have, and we truly want to engage in a conversation, because I think, in digital marketing for a long time, it's not always been about having a conversation. It's more about, here's what I have to say. And you guys, hopefully you do what I want you to do. And that's, the signal that we're all in the same place together, that you actually bought the thing I want you to do, or you've gone to the website, or whatever it is that you want me to do. But if we're really going to have a conversation, then it has to start from a place of really wanting to have this dialogue and understanding, the emotions that are part of that, and then writing it from the perspective of that person and going with them on the journey, together, that we want to take. So, again, that question of like, can emotional intelligence be brokered through a device? It's like, absolutely. The device is certainly stoic, and it doesn't have necessarily life inside of it, but it is being programmed by people who do. And so we can, control all of that and trigger it on the emotions that we need to in order to have and build a relationship.
Yeah, no, I like that you're saying that it's still controlled by the people that create it. It's really important. And so you guys have come up with a kind of 4-system framework. And so, Greg, do you want to show us what that looks like? And we'll kind of go through it. Anyone that's watching live, if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to write them in, and I'll bring them up on the screen so that either of them can answer them. So Greg, I'll have you bring up that image for us to see.
Yeah, it should be up now, I think.
Not yet. Yeah, that's okay. So it is, as you're doing it, I will describe it. So there are 4 main parts to it. The first is, here we go. Perfect.
Bring it up here.
It's going to show us. So there's 4 parts, and we have, the first part is motivation, then it goes into exploration, then familiarity, and then bond. And it's kind of a cycle over and over again. And so I'd love for you to start with this first piece about motivation. What does that mean? How do we kind of create that from a voice experience? And where does this start within the voice journey as a whole?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I think, as we think about this whole, framework in general, it starts from a place, where we don't necessarily have a conversation that's begun yet. So we've got to actually bring someone into it, which is the point of motivation. We've got to motivate them to actually want to have the conversation. But the other thing that we're seeing here, as you mentioned, it's cyclical, right? So the idea isn't that we just have one conversation. The idea is that we have multiple conversations over time. And so that motivation that existed to get someone to the experience now becomes the motivation to get them to come back to the experience. And so, again, that cyclical point is really critical. And I'll stop sharing my screen. I think you guys may understand where this goes, and we're happy to bring it back up. But the idea of motivation is that, again, it goes back to the point of the premise I was just talking about before. What is it that is important for the user? What are those emotional needs that they have, the wants and desires that they have too, because those are important as well, that we can tap into as a brand or as an organization that's looking to have a conversation with someone. And so if we're really doing things right, then we're thinking about it from that perspective. What are their rational motivators? And what are those things that are just kind of intrinsic that they need to have? And then what are some of those other motivators that over time are going to get them to explore this conversation further, which is obviously the next step in terms of exploration. And there's a lot of different ways that this comes to be. Like, motivation is kind of like the spark to the fire in the end. If you take what I was just saying before, we need something that kind of gets us going, that causes us to act, that causes us to click on something, or in this case, invoke something. And it's in the end kind of the why to the what someone does. It's the influence behind what they do. And as we thought about motivation, we also thought about, like, there's different mechanics to it. One It's just knowing that it exists, being aware that it's there. And so, there's someone who is aware of something perhaps, and they've never really operated on it. But then there's someone who's aware of something and they've been alerted to it, and now they're taking action. So even within some of these mechanics, there's different states in the emotion of the user that they actually need to use it now. There's also, a sense of, which goes back to the point I talked about with Campbell's earlier, but the sense of authority. Brands or other people, we often come to talk to people because they have something that we don't. There's this answer that they can provide to us. And so in a sea of answers that exists, the person on the other end, the consumer, needs to know that there's a true voice of authority when they're invoking a skill or an action or a voice experience in order to dig into a conversation. Another mechanic that we talk about as we think about motivation is enticement, this kind of level of attraction. There's knowing something that exists, and then there's wanting to actually walk toward it or engage in a conversation or a relationship with it. And so this level of attraction, this kind of sexiness factor to how we pick out someone from a crowd to speak to, because of what they possess. And so as we think about ourselves and how we can engage someone in a conversation, there has to be a little bit of that comes into play here. And then, of course, there's the different types of value that's there. So there's some intrinsic value, the value the voice experience has on its own merit. What does it bring to the table? And then there's this sense of value, this imbued sense of value. What is it that the user perceives the voice experience is going to do for them? Because it's amplifying their needs and wants. It's going to be the solution to this problem that they have. And that they feel this brand or this organization or this thing can help them solve. And the last part of it is like knowing, not just knowing that it's there, but knowing where to find it. And this is the part where I think brands often fail a lot on. It's called discovery in another term when people talk about it. But knowing that something is where to find it and how to go about it, that can take form in a lot of different ways. And so there's all these different mechanics that we've thought about from a motivation standpoint. I know I've been going on for a little bit, so I don't know if Sina, you want to add anything there?
And Sina, before
I think
I was just going to say,
sure.
Sina, if you could also, as you're answering, maybe give us like examples, like if for a certain industry or a certain company of how they would go through a motivation process, whether that's questions they would ask themselves or give us maybe specifics.
Yeah, I mean, practically speaking, when we look at the motivation stage, it's really thinking about pre-launch. It's really thinking about why would somebody want to use your voice application. And one of the issues that I found whenever I was speaking with brands is that there was no differentiation between their products or services being a low involvement product or a high involvement product. Low involvement products historically mean that there's not much involvement when you're making the decision as a user to purchase the product. So it could be something such as a beverage, it could be something such as toilet paper. What a high involvement product, on the other hand, is something like life insurance or an expensive holiday. There's going to be a higher cognitive load. There's going to be more elements you're going to look into for you to make your decision. The reason why this is relevant to motivation is because once you determine and define what type of category your product falls into, you can then start pulling on those motivational strings, whether it's through marketing. A good example I saw was Coca-Cola when they released a new flavor. They had just like the normal marketing that they would do, advertising, whether it was in the paper, whether it was online, generating the awareness about the existence of the application, tapping onto the motivation through what they call peripheral advertising, which is, since it's a low involvement product, you don't want too much information there to motivate the person to use it. You want to just instill a little level of enticement, a little level of attraction to get them to activate the voice application. In this case, it was Send Me a Sample, which is a voice application which sends samples of new products released by brands. In this case, it was the Coca-Cola flavor. So it's really important to understand that whenever you're delving into the motivational mechanics, you start differentiating between whether your product is low involvement or high involvement, and that will really impact your marketing strategy. Do you want the marketing to be very information heavy, or do you want it to really attract and get the person into that next step, which is obviously exploration?
Yeah, and I think, as we think about it again, there's this cycle to it. So there's that beginning part where we're attracting people in to have that initial conversation. So we need to do some things through marketing, and make sure that we're clarifying the benefits of what we provide, and drawing people to the right place to find us and how to invoke us. And then once they're there, though, we also need to get them to come back. We need to motivate them to come back the second time, the third time, the fourth. And so some of those ideas of retention come into play here too. Things like gamification. It doesn't have to be a game. It doesn't necessarily have to be a leaderboard or something that exists in order to get people to come back. But creating a reason, dropping those breadcrumbs that can allow them to come back. So enticing them with knowing that they haven't completed the full journey yet, that there's more to come. So you see that happen in a lot of different ways. Or rewarding them for what they have completed while you're doing that, so that they get a sense of a positivity associated with you and with the experience that they've had. They feel like they've accomplished something, they've become better, or whatever it is that you're doing for them. And so then they want to come back, again the next time. Or it may just be that it was so easy. For instance, when we were working with Starbucks, and we were building a skill for them back in 2016. So it was a while back. And so there's different things I'm sure you would always change if you go back that far. But we wanted to make it simple for them to come in and just be able to order their regular coffee. We found that most people, in talking with Starbucks, most of the people were doing that every day. And you all do this. Most of the time we go in and order the same exact thing from the same exact place. So why not just make it so simple for them? And sometimes you don't have to have a long conversation for it to be fruitful. And so, again, I think there's a lot of different things we can think about. Even there's the pre and then in the middle of the conversation that we need to think about too, from a motivational standpoint.
So for those that are joining
on motivation. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I just want to say, for those that are joining, we're on the first step of the framework, which is we're talking about motivation. So Sina, what other thoughts do you have on this before we move to our step 2 of the framework?
I would say that one of the final points I'd make on the fundamental nature of motivation is really understanding it's not even a voice-related understanding. It's a product, a service understanding. What would motivate your customers, your users, to want to have a voice application in their assistant, in their Echo, about your product or service? Some people think, for example, a toilet paper brand, why would you want to have a voice application? What is there that would motivate a user to want to use a voice application from a brand that produces toilet paper? There are motivators that exist.
We have that answer, I think, right? Where can I find it?
Indeed. So it's really beyond voice technology. I think the motivation stage is really digging into why someone would want to not only use your product and use your service, but interact with your product, interact with your service, or interact with your brand via a voice application, instead of just having a sexy new application for a need that really isn't there.
After we go through this, we get to our step 2. And again, this is, Greg, can you show us that picture again real quick? Because as people are listening or tuning in, it's not necessarily a ladder, but rather a circle, as we're kind of coming back to these over and over again. So we just talked about our motivation being kind of that first one, and I'll have Greg show it up here for our image. And as we get into the second one, now we're getting into the exploration. So again, really thinking of it as a circle, as a cycle, rather than a ladder kind of going up or down. So we'll go back. Sina, I'll have you start with exploration. So what does this step 2 include?
Yeah, so exploration is fundamentally first impressions, the onboarding experience. So you've been motivated enough to go and activate the application. What do you as a designer need to ensure is present during that exploratory stage? I really started to look in, again, because I was studying my MBA, I had a lot of access to learning about the psychology and the evolutionary development of the things we do. So I started to think, why is it that first impressions matter so much anyway? There are many times we'll go on a website or a mobile app or whatever it is, and if the first time we use it isn't pleasurable or utilitarian enough, we just don't go back to it. And the psychology and the evolutionary development that I really looked into was that our ancestors, when they were in a certain situation, they had to immediately perceive whether it was positive or negative. And if they had any inkling, or if they had any sense that this position or this situation was negative, the fight or flight mechanism would kick in. They wouldn't risk survival time in trying to identify whether or not the situation is really safe or not. So fear was almost like the first instinct that kicked in a situation that you're a little bit unknown about. And that historical development has a lot of primal baggage in modern psychology today. So we haven't got rid of those primal fears. So that's why it's so important that first impressions in relationships, in friendships, in real life go well, and first impressions with your voice applications go well as well. So seeing the first impressions matter, I try to look at what situation in nature or in society do we see first impressions really mattering? And I came to the conclusion it's dating. Given the fact that first dates can be quite ruthless, especially since I had many failed ones. Greg, I'm sure you said you had a few as well, which made me feel better. But looking at the first date, looking at the situation within a first date and the kind of ambiance, the factors, the elements that make up a first date, you're really able to determine from those principles in society how you can make the first date with your voice application during that exploratory stage successful enough to bring you back for a second date. And some of the stats that were out there, it's 3 to 5% of voice applications get used again after a week. And that's a horrific
3 to 5.
First
that's
date.
What you said. 3 to 5%.
3 to 5%.
Only 3 to 5% get reused a second time.
Only 3 to 5% get used a second time. And this was fascinating because we were able to see that the first date is what was going wrong. A lot of these apps, they have a lot of intricate design, intricate features that the engineer, the developer, the product teams really want the user to use, but the user never got to know about them because that exploratory stage didn't go well. So this first stage is so critical. So I really broke it down. I took the principles from a successful first date and tried to bring them into practical terms. And a lot of things we're discussing is very much in the abstract and in theory, and try to reduce it down to how it can manifest in a voice design. So there's 6 principles within the exploratory stage, which is based on the first date theory. So I'll go through just a couple because I don't want to dig in too much, but to go through the 6 is generating awareness. So, you've come into the date, you really want the person to know about you, but you don't want them to know too much because you're kind of like extending your stay beyond the limits of what it should be, but you want to tell them enough about what you're able to offer for them to come back again. Now, there are tons of apps out there where when you first activate it, you have no idea what it does. You just don't know what it's going to provide you. So generating that awareness in that exploratory stage of letting the users know what exactly this app functions as in their life is critical. One of the other features is personalization. Is the app going to provide some sort of unique feature or experience for you as the user, or is it pretty vanilla for anyone out there? So one of the lines that I use is, is this a one-night stand, or is it something a little bit more intimate? Because the experience that you're having, the conversations that you're having are more personalized, and it's not just the same old, chatty lines and the same old conversation that you have on every other date. You're really trying to personalize it for that interaction. And finally, there are 6, but I'm only mentioning 3 of them, multimodal. So during the exploratory stage, it'll be really good to know whether the experience that you're having with this voice application or this conversation that you're having can extend beyond the home device, beyond the mobile device, beyond the TV, beyond email. Can you have this consistent conversation throughout this multimodality of devices that we're seeing arising, and really trying to figure out how can you make this stage build enough of a good experience where the user will come back again and again and again, just like a relationship.
I love that. And I feel like that applies to marketing and business as a whole, not just voice. So I love that you're bringing it into this space as well. Greg, what is your, any follow-up or anything you want to add to what he just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think, how we position ourselves for someone to want to come back to us is really critical. And I think to your point, like we try to force so much because we have this limited amount of time we feel that we have with someone to really share everything that we can do. And so you see so many voice experiences that just bloat that first entry point when someone invokes the experience, and it's just the menu, right? It's just everything that's possible. And it's not really showing that we can be concise, that we're going to offer a quick conversation or a quick answer to what might be there. But we're also, at the point of blabbing on to the point where people might not pay attention anymore. So I think that's a really important piece of all of this too. And I think, where this, again, the cycle of this comes back, right? There's this initial sense of exploration, where, you have to get people back for the second date. But then there's the back when they come again, we need to make sure that we are providing them with something of value at that point as well. That that the second date actually has a rhyme and reason to it, and that we're building toward a relationship with one another. And so I should know on a date. I think you even use this when you bring this up. But like, well, do you drink or do you not drink? And I'm not going to offer you something after my second, third, fourth date if you're someone who doesn't drink or doesn't like meat. I'm not going to offer you pepperoni on your pizza on our date, or hopefully we're doing something better than that. I just ruined any future. Thankfully I'm married.
That's why the first dates went so bad, Greg. You just exposed
exactly. But I think you need to know enough about the person, which goes into the next step, which is about familiarity as well and how you do that. But you need to know enough and express that in a way. And so we need to make sure that instead of the example where people are blabbing on, now we need to be more specific. Now I need to be cognizant of the fact that you've been here before. I don't need to repeat everything. And so when we work on experiences, like we just launched one in the fall for Game Show Network. There was a skill called Common Knowledge. It's a game show. And this is a similar technique that a lot of people use, but there's the first time experience, and there's the second time experience, and there's the fifth time experience. Second time, I might need to explain myself a little bit more and kind of recap where we've been and what we can do. Third time, I'm just going to say, are you ready to play? Because you already know what we do. We can get right in and we can get started. And I think we need to design our experiences that way, to allow for when someone is motivated to come explore us again and have another conversation, that we're cognizant of who they are and the journey we've been on together.
Yeah, really making it more human is what it sounds like. And we just have a quick question. I don't know if you can answer this one. Hal says, how might overselling system capability impact first impressions? Do either of you want to answer that or have any comments on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, as I said, if you're in a first date, you forget that. You as a human have a lot of capabilities. You have a lot to offer. Do you really want to get all of those capabilities across in that short space of time that you've got on the first date? So in this exploratory stage, if we're trying to translate it into practical terms for voice, it's great that your app might have tons of features, but it doesn't mean that you have to let the user know about all of these features through the voice application. I'll give you an example. There was a hotel in Vegas where they had a voice application, a voice assistant with an application. Now, when I activated the application, it didn't blurt out all of the things that it can do. It let me know its capabilities and it let me know its features. It had a little leaflet on the side, and we might think leaflets are a little bit outdated. This might be just an example that's applicable and viable for this hotel chain, but it was able to let me know of the capabilities, not in a way where it was just blurting out and blurting out. I mean, the number of apps, just today I was going through a few with my wife, and the number of apps that just go out there, as Greg said, and just go soft through a whole list. You kind of think to yourself, this isn't the kind of emotionally intelligent experience that I would expect in society. So why would I expect it on a voice application? And why does it matter with voice applications? It's because voice at the end of the day promises us communication, and communication is human. So we need to take as many principles as we can from human communication and human relationships to make these voice experiences what they were supposed to be, human.
And I think there's I guess the analog would be, you just got to be subtle. Like you can very easily say a lot about yourself without saying it. And it's hard to think about that in a voice experience context, but I'll get back to that in a second. But, if we're on a date, the environment that we're in, hopefully I'm not taking you out for pizza, but, the environment we're in, and maybe that works though for the person that you're trying to court, or the clothes you're wearing, the choices that you make that inform everything that you're doing. The whole conversation is important. And I think from a voice experience design perspective, we can take those cues. It might be how the use of sound and the production value that we put into the experience that we have. It could be the exact words that we use, and we kind of can demonstrate. Are we are we playing down at this level? Or are we playing up here? And is this highbrow? And so there's so many different things we can do. Even with the visuals, we talk about voice only, but it's not voice only, it's voice first. So
Yep.
Even the design of the screens that we have and how we cue those up and when we cue those up, all those little subtle things tell people about the quality of the conversation that they're having. And so we can think about it from that perspective too, and not have to oversell so hard up at first, but still communicate what we have to bring to the table.
We're going to move to step 3. Greg, I'm going to have you show that image again, if you don't mind, each step we're doing. So we're going on to familiarity. So again, if you're just joining us, there are 4 steps here, or again, rather 4 within the circle phase. So we talked first about motivation and exploration. And now we're going to that 3rd step of familiarity. So let's talk about what this is, what this means, and kind of where this comes into play.
Cool. Yeah. So as we think about familiarity, this is once we've again, got someone to start that, have that conversation with us. We want to demonstrate, as any good conversation does, that we're building context with someone. And that context actually starts from the very beginning. You don't have to be on a 2nd date or a 3rd date or 4th date to have context. That happens progressively, even as we're talking. We know each other, from a few conversations so far, but you already know what I might answer maybe in a different way than what Sina's going to be able to answer. Certain things about the conversation that we're involved in, and so that context is really critical. And you don't have to have some rich data house, and that'd be great if you do, and you have all this knowledge that you're able to tie into the experience from all of your other touch points. You can just do that based off of what we're hearing and keeping track of that, and then progressively adding to that over time. So again, that cyclical nature of things, it's about what's happening in this conversation, but it's about all the conversations that we've been having. And so you want to make sense. We want to make sure that we're with someone that knows us. And the more familiar we are with something, and this is from psychology, but the more familiar we are with something, the more likely we are to use it over and over and over again, to come back to it over and over and over again, because it's comfortable. And so again, that context becomes really critical to establish, and that can be done, as I mentioned, by just keeping track of simple things. So as we think about back to the Game Show Network example, what progress are we at? How many games have we played? And where am I in the experience over time? 1st, 2nd, 5th time. It might be that you actually have the ability to log into a system that exists, and you have some context from that greater relationship that you've had. And hopefully you've been keeping track of that. Hopefully you've been logging those different signals people have been sending through the websites and the apps that they've been using. But you can do some of that. Some of it might be done through lookalike kind of modeling. So that the fact that we know certain people prefer this type of thing, and you've identified yourself as this type of person based off what you've said so far to us and what you've interacted with so far to us, that might help us surface something in a conversation and offer up the right podcast, or offer up the right piece of content that someone might interact with, or even the right ingredients or recipes or whatever it might be, whatever the experience is that's there. So again, all these different touch points that we have, if we can think about them and bring them in where they're relevant, and especially based off the conversation that we're having, then there's a lot that we have to go on. And I think a lot of people also forget there's a premise for why this thing existed, why this voice experience even existed. And there's familiarity, there's context right there. Someone's coming to us because of a specific need that we've tapped into, that they've been motivated to explore us for. So, we need to make sure that we're starting from that common ground from the start, because there's a lot of context there. So anyways, that's familiarity. I don't know, Sina, if there's anything else you would add to that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I explored from, I discovered from some voice applications that I enjoy using, the familiarity element really makes a difference, because it's something that invokes pleasure as opposed to just providing utility. Usually when we think as developers, as designers, about what we want to build into our applications, we think along the lines of utility. So it's almost like, let's try and provide as much utility as we possibly can. That will provide a good experience. But actually, that's very much an old school mentality, in my opinion. I think the new school mentality is very much beyond just providing utility, it's providing pleasure. And when somebody remembers something about you, there's something emotional about that makes you want to keep on coming back. So it's the onus is on us as designers, as engineers, as product people to find out the patterns in the use of our applications beyond just voice, to try and figure out how can we build in that familiarity that goes way beyond just utility, but a little bit deeper, because it's what we expect in relationships as well.
Yeah, and my follow-up to that is that, I mean, it makes sense what you're saying. I think most people want their voice skill to remember them so they don't have to keep repeating themselves or saying the same thing, but that's usually not the case. You have a lot of people that are creating their own skills on their own. You have people hiring agencies like yourself. You have companies trying to do it themselves. Do you have to have like a huge team or at a certain level to create kind of that AI learning and familiarity, or no?
No, I mean, again, you can do it based off of, just the conversation that you're having, and just a matter of keeping track of it. So, you just need to make sure that we don't necessarily know everything about the person that we're speaking with. From a technical standpoint, they're anonymous in a lot of cases to us, but they're not really anonymous if we're storing everything from the point that they started with us and enabled that skill or action to the point that they disable it. All of that's stuff we can access and stuff that we can use. And anyone who's storing a sense of I guess what's technically called state, but a sense of place, where that this person played this game, or that they already looked at or heard these 3 different podcasts before, or whatever the experience is. If you're keeping track of that in some capacity, that's familiarity right there. It's so simple to be able to do. And even subtle things, just making sure that you're keeping track of, again, the times that someone has come to us, or the time of day it might be that they're coming to us. Looking at just analytics for how someone uses, or how your whole user body uses an experience, and using that to inform the decisions that you make, because of again, acknowledging what people use more and what people use less. That's surfacing those things is going to create a sense of familiarity, because you're at least acknowledging. So there's things anybody can do that they don't have to have a team, even that they can do it based off of them and the kind of the premise of how they're setting this thing up, and how they're leveraging the data.
I'd say a good example of it is H&M Gift Finder, the application on Google Assistant. If you want to see an example that I think we can get even better examples of familiarity, but for me, the best example I've seen of familiarity thus far is the H&M Gift Finder Google Assistant application, because once I've gone in and looked at some items that I'm thinking of purchasing for my homes, for my friend's housewarming party. They've just got a new house. I'm trying to figure out what it is I want to get for them. It's identified the things that I'm interested in the next few times that I've gone into the application for the next friend I'm trying to find a gift for. So something like that, I could not be using it for months. It's still built in that familiarity, where it's such a simple thing that needs to be done. There's no machine learning expert that really requires that. It's just picking up on where you left off. And I'm still trying to figure out who actually developed and designed the H&M Gift Finder app. So if anyone out there knows, please message me, because I want to send them a bottle of wine.
I love that. Greg, I'm going to have you bring up that image one more time for our final part of the cycle. And I'm putting it in the chat here so we can all see it. So our final part of the cycle here is bond. So again, we were talking about motivation, exploration, and familiarity. Then we go into bond. So what does that mean? What is this kind of completing the circle of the step?
Sure. So I'd say bond is less of a stage. It's more of an outcome. It's more of a thread that exists once you've motivated someone to use it. They've explored it and it's been successful. You've built in the familiarity, and through those 3 things, you've built a bond, just like you would in a relationship. This is very much based on the Knox relational model, which holds that a bond is less of a stage, it's less of a destination, it's more of an ongoing theme once you've done the first things right. So the kind of things that you can really achieve during a bond stage is more than just retention. It's a sense of familiarity that goes beyond just the voice application, but it's more of a bond on a macro level with the brand. And the kind of questions that I always suggest companies to look into to try and achieve this bond stage is trying to figure out, is the voice interaction typically the first point of contact that the user will have with your brand? Is the channel a kind of last resort where they were trying to contact you through the mobile application? They were trying to find out information through the website, and they're coming to this as a last resort. Are they using it out of want, or is it out of necessity? Is it for fun? Is it for convenience? What might the user be doing at the time that they're actually exploring this voice application? Are they cooking? Are they dealing with the kids? Are they focusing because it's a high involvement product or service that you're offering? And I think something that's really important is once you've gathered all the analytics and metrics that Greg mentioned through the familiarity stage, is trying to figure out what the typical attitude of the user is during the voice experience, regardless of the feature that they've been using throughout the life cycle of exploration and familiarity. And when you kind of put all of these together, you have a relationship. And within that relationship, you can have short little flings. And what I mean by that is you have these apps out there, which all they're used for is a one-time use. You want to get a sample of something, or you want to try something, you invoke it once and that's it. That's fine, but what we would call that's a one-night stand, that's a fling. That's great, that's fine. But in the context of a relationship, in the context of, a long-term vision, a long-term interaction that you're having with this user, those things are fine. But if you're doing it as a one-off cheap shot, if you're doing it as a one-off, experience, we don't think that's an emotionally intelligent experience. That's just a good way of, getting your item out there, and that's it. So the bond stage really isn't a stage. It's really more of a thread that holds all of the stages together, and it kind of gets you in check to develop more and more as you go across the cycle.
Mm-hmm. And I think, again, as it strengthens over time, at the beginning, it might be that I think I know where I can go to get this information. I think I know where I can go to get a steak tip. That was where I wanted to get it from, or I think this place has the best content, or whatever it might be. But then as you get over time and that bond strengthens and tightens even more as we go through this cycle more, you get to the place where there's no one else, I know exactly where to go. It's inherent that when I have this question, they have the answer, and I can only go to this source. And so, I think that's the critical part of bond. Is kind of the glue that holds it all together. It's the stage we're trying to achieve when we're starting out and we don't have any connection whatsoever. And it's the thing we're trying to hold on to the whole rest of the time. So everything we do next time and every time and everything from when they invoke it to when they leave, and even the stuff in between when we're trying to remind them that we exist in those earlier days, that is critical to kind of tightening that relationship and making this really work.
So is
a key. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, as you're talking about, go ahead, Sina.
One of the key principles really of the bond stage is transparency. We build relationships with people who we have a level of transparency with. The reason why some of our favorite restaurants are the ones where the kitchen is visible to us is because there's a level of transparency. Greg and I don't have the answers of how transparent you can be in the interactions that you're having with the user via voice application, but we do know that transparency is key to achieving bond. So how is it? It's more of a question. It's more of an investigation that we need to really undertake in these early stages of the industry. How can we build transparency through voice applications? Is it by letting them know how we come up with some of our algorithms? Is it the familiarity that we're building in? Do we kind of not expose, but let them in on how it is that we get to the familiarity that they're experiencing? But this transparency thing, I think it's something that's really missing in voice, and if we really want to build voice applications that are being used again and again and again, we have to figure out how can we provide transparency to the user in the context of a voice experience.
And it may just be in how we prepare the kind of fallback responses, and kind of letting people know where the fringes of our abilities are, letting them know that we can't solve everything, that there are things that we can help them with, there are things that they can't, and let them know when they're off track and guide them back, that we're there to help them. I think, by exposing the kitchen per se of our limitations, then it can help them see that we are emotionally available for them to help them, in times of need, and that there are places that they may need to go to get something else, and that don't go down this road because it could be something that we can't satisfy.
So when is the
managing expectations?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I feel like, is there a dating voice application coming soon based off of all of this?
Ah, damn it! She found out, Greg.
The world needs it. It's we're ready for it. So we have a couple other questions. Greg, can you show up that picture one more time for people that are joining? So if you have any questions these last few minutes, you're welcome to ask them. I just want to have him show the image one more time as we're talking about this cycle overall. Again, thinking of it as a cyclical thing, there's 4 pieces. So we have that motivation, exploration, familiarity, and bond stage. Now we do have a couple other questions, so I'm going to bring it back to our faces. So I think it's Kyra. She says, thank you for this conversation. She has a couple questions here. What are some examples of ways you can reward users without leaderboards?
Some of it's acknowledgement. When you think about, sometimes just being, acknowledged that by name. Some of it's being remembered. Some of it is, as we think about digital rewards, there's often, I mentioned before, like progress that can be tracked, and we can give them a sense of, place by giving them an exclamation if it's a voice only type of experience, or if it's got a multimodal capability, giving them actually something they can collect and see and feel like it's theirs, that they've earned. So there's definitely things that you can do that are apart from leaderboards, but involve this sense of gamification and the sense of reward that can feel like they're getting something out of it. Sina, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's exactly. The IKEA effect. Nirayal of behavioral scientists who created the hook model, which forms a lot of the principles of the model that we designed for voice. He holds, it's very important to have a sort of intrinsic reward system within any application that you're developing, because of the IKEA effect. We imbue value into things that we have created ourselves, even though the IKEA table that you built is probably a piece of garbage. That doesn't matter. The fact that you built it means a lot. So trying to build in that IKEA effect into these experiences, I think, is an alternative to leaderboards.
And I'm going to have, she has one other question here too. What are some examples of transparency you can use within the app experience?
Yeah, I think to Sina's point, there's a question, that we throw back somewhat, but some of the ones that I mentioned, I think, exposing, kind of the walls of your expertise, and kind of expressing what you can and can't do, and especially if someone pushes at that, being prepared for that. I think there are a lot of experiences where, there are failures that happen if someone tries to, push a little bit too far. Sometimes they push at the boundaries of it because they're trying to play a game and see how far they can take this thing. And if you've planned for everything, that can be uttered. But, just letting people know what the walls of that are, exposing, that you're there to help for them. Managing expectations is something we talked about. And you can do that through just the words you share, setting things up in the beginning about, here's what we can do, here's what we can't. The help experience should be contextual, and making sure that we kind of acknowledge where someone is, and then also say, like, here's what I can do now, and here's what you can do if you're in some other type of part of the voice experience. But yeah, I think there's some light things to do, and then I think there's even more that we need to push further and explore this even more, because I think to Sina's point, we need to, if we're really going to be invested emotionally, we have to expose ourselves. And so that transparency becomes critical.
Yeah. And my, just to kind of tie it all in together. So we talked about kind of these 4 stages again. Obviously it's a circle, so it keeps happening over and over again. But how long would you say it typically takes, again, every project is different, for a voice scale to kind of go through all 4 cycles?
mean, it can happen instantaneously in some ways. You might see that a skill exists or an action exists because you saw a commercial or some marketing that existed that's out there from the brand perspective. You came through it in your social feed or something else that encouraged you to invoke it right away because you're in that moment of wanting to, you need that thing right away, and that ad helped you figure that out. It acknowledges you and kind of becomes familiar with you because of, again, the premise that it exists with, but also the fact that when you gave it some information, maybe it was a recipe experience, to go back to where this all started for me, and you said that, I'm a vegetarian, it didn't give me a meat recipe, and it invited me back. And then the bond can happen to the point where they leave, and then all of a sudden they're like, that was great, I can't wait to cook this. I'm going to try this again tomorrow when I need to figure out what I need to cook again. So it can happen super fast. And it can also take time. Some experiences, I think when we judge voice experiences on metrics like how often they've come back, that's an important metric. You want people to come back, but some things are meant to be handled daily, and some things are meant to, if I don't have another stain, we built an experience for Tide, people have stains all the time, but if they don't come back because they don't have a stain, that's not necessarily a bad thing that they didn't come back, as long as they come back the next time they do. If we haven't seen them in 3 weeks, maybe they haven't had an issue. And maybe they're able to help them with the issues they've been having. But what I want to be on the other end of is when they do have the next challenge, they have the next stain in that case, that they invoke me again in this experience for this brand that we're building this for. So again, I think we need to think about it from a standpoint of just it can happen quick or it can happen fast, and that's okay. It's just a matter of the fact that it's happening at all is critical.
You've just touched on just one point that I think is so crucial in the whole discussion about emotional intelligence, is that there's a difference between usage and usefulness.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout
Yes.
a lot of the discussions that we have about applications, whether it's voice, mobile, whatever it is, we think the best target, the best objective is usage. But it's not. It's when you are called upon, are you useful? That may not translate into a high usage. That's why you have to think of voice as not the solution. It is a solution within the consumer journey. You have to take the time out to identify where it is most viable within that journey, and where it provides the most value. So we need to move away from the short-term thinking of usage and really rely more on the long-term truths of usefulness.
Yeah, beautifully said. Where can people learn more about each of you, connect with each of you, learn about your company? Sina, I'll start with you.
So I'm the co-founder now of the voicecourse.co. My friend and colleague Adi Kariat in Israel, she's a Google Assistant expert. We developed a Udemy course, which currently has a Corona lockdown discount available. So do get in touch on LinkedIn, Sina Kahen, Instagram, Sina Kahen, SinaKahen. So reach out to me there, and happy to have you all join the course.
And if anyone wants to reach out and learn more about Rain, rain.agency is the website, and feel free to explore there. There's a form you can email us and get in touch. And if you are interested in following me, Replica78 is my Twitter handle. I don't know why you have to go back too far in my brain to tell you why that, but Replica78. And then feel free to connect on LinkedIn, and happy to have a conversation. And hopefully we'll lead to a place like this. We'll be exploring something together down the road soon.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been really helpful and informative. Again, if you joined in a little later or you're listening later, definitely go back, go through the framework. It's been really helpful for anyone within the voice tech space, whether you're on your own or with an agency or just want to explore it. So thank you, Sina and Greg. So excited and glad that you could join us.
Thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all the great work you're doing, Carrie.
Thank you. We will chat again soon.
Sounds good.
Indeed.